Yokosuka Naval Base, September 1st, 1945. Tomorrow, on the deck of the USS Missouri, 4 years of war would end with the stroke of a pen. Tonight, one man walked alone through the wreckage of the enemy's greatest naval yard. No entourage, no cameras, no reporters. Chester Nimitz had spent 4 years destroying the Imperial Japanese Navy, ship by ship, island by island. Tomorrow he would sign the document that made it official. But tonight, he stopped in front of something that shouldn't have mattered anymore. An old battleship, its hull sealed in concrete, paint peeling, stripped bare by souvenir-hunting soldiers. A ship that hadn't sailed in 20 years. Its name was Mikasa, the flagship of the one enemy Admiral Nimitz had studied since he was 20 years old, standing in a Tokyo garden, watching a man who had just won the greatest naval battle of the century act like it meant nothing at all. Now America's allies wanted that ship gone, erased, and the man who had just finished burying the Japanese Navy was about to do something no one expected, the day before he accepted their surrender. This is not the story of how Nimitz won the war. This is the story of what he did after, and why Japan never forgot it. Go back 40 years, the summer of 1905. A 20-year-old midshipman named Chester Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Ohio, a battleship making port calls across the Western Pacific. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in Annapolis only months earlier, one more young officer in a navy that had barely tested itself in real combat, that had fought its first modern war against Spain just 7 years before, and was still trying to understand what kind of navy it needed to become in a world that was changing faster than anyone in Washington seemed willing to admit. He did not know, standing on that deck, that he was about to witness something that would stay lodged in him for the rest of his life, something he would never fully explain to anyone, not in letters, not in interviews, not in the reports he would file decades later as the most powerful admiral in the Pacific. The Emperor of Japan was hosting a garden party. It was a celebration, and everyone in that garden understood exactly what was being celebrated. A few weeks earlier, in the narrow strait between Japan and Korea, the Imperial Japanese Navy had done something no Asian power had ever done to a European one in the modern era. It had met a European fleet in open battle and annihilated it. The ships had come from the other side of the world. The Russian Baltic fleet had sailed 18,000 miles, 7 months at sea, around the coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, all the way to the waters near Japan, hoping to reach the port of Vladivostok and reverse the course of a war that was already going badly for Russia on land. A man named Heihachiro Togo was waiting for them. Togo was 57 years old that summer. He was not a man who had arrived at his rank through birth or connections. He had spent 7 years as a young officer studying in England, learning naval science from the country that still, in those years, commanded the largest and most sophisticated fleet on Earth. He came home and applied everything he had learned with the same patience the Japanese military brought to anything it decided was worth mastering completely. On the morning of May 27, 1905, the Russian fleet appeared out of the haze, exhausted from months at sea, its hulls fouled, its crews worn thin by the voyage, before they had fired a single shot. Togo gave an order that naval officers would study for the rest of the century. He turned his line of ships directly across the head of the Russian column, a maneuver that let every gun on every Japanese ship fire at once, while the Russians in front of the column could only answer with their forward guns. It was called crossing the T. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. By the time the guns went quiet, 21 Russian warships were sunk. 6 more were captured. What had been one of the largest fleets ever assembled by a European power no longer existed as a fighting force in the Pacific. It had taken 2 days. Smoke had hung over the strait so thick that spotters on shore lost sight of the horizon. Men who survived the sinkings spent hours in cold water, waiting for boats that were not always coming. The Russians had crossed half the world to reach that strait, and in the space of a single morning, and the night that followed, Almost none of what they had brought with them was left afloat. That was the man standing in the garden that Chester Nimitz had been sent to observe. And what struck the young American was not what Togo had done. Every officer in that garden already knew what he had done. What struck Nimitz was how Togo behaved now that it was over. He moved through the crowd without ceremony. He was talking with a group of young American officers, and he was laughing easily, like a man who had nothing left to prove and no interest in pretending otherwise. There was no performance in it, no message being delivered for the benefit of the foreign observers standing nearby. He talked the way a man talks when the work is finished, when the record already speaks for itself, and there is no longer any reason to be anything other than exactly what you are. Nimitz never wrote down what was said in that conversation. No diary entry survived, if one was ever written at all, but the image did not leave him. You can tell, because of what happened 3 months before that garden party, in a hospital on the other side of Japan, and because of what Nimitz did with that image 29 years later. In June of 1905, a Russian officer named Zinovy Rozhestvensky lay in a naval hospital in the port town of Sasebo. He had commanded the Baltic Fleet on its long, doomed voyage across the world, and he had been found unconscious aboard a destroyer during the final hours of the battle, wounded, barely alive, transferred to a hospital ship, and carried ashore under guard. He would survive. He would be sent home to Russia. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain, in writing, in testimony, in the quiet hours no one else witnessed, what had happened to his fleet in that strait, and whether any of it could have gone differently. But in June of 1905, he was a beaten man in a hospital bed, in the country of the enemy, who had beaten him. And Togo came to see him. He walked into the ward. He sat down beside the bed. He took the Russian admiral's hand in his own, and he said words that would be written down and repeated for generations afterward. Defeat is an accident common to every fighting man. There is no cause for shame in it, if you have done your duty. There was no ceremony attached to that visit, no press conference, no official statement. It was recorded briefly in the newspapers of the time, and then it was forgotten by almost everyone who read about it. One officer visiting another officer who had been wounded in the battle between them. Whatever else passed between those two men in that room stayed in that room. Nimitz knew about that visit. He had studied Togo the way officers of his generation studied the men who had changed naval warfare, not only the tactics at Tsushima, not only the maneuver that ended a fleet in 2 days, but what the man had done once the shooting stopped. The hospital visit. The words at the bedside of a man he had just defeated. He had been paying attention since he was 20 years old, standing in that garden, watching an old admiral behave as though winning the greatest naval battle of the century was not, in the end, the most important thing that had happened that year. In 1934, Togo died. He was 86 years old. Japan gave him a funeral built for a national hero, the kind of send-off a country reserves for the handful of men it decides to build its identity around. Chester Nimitz, by then a captain, with a career and a schedule that did not leave room for casual travel overseas, made the trip to Tokyo anyway. He attended the public funeral. Then he went to the smaller, private service held for family, a service that required no diplomatic invitation, no order from the Navy Department, nothing but a decision that he wanted to be there. He never explained why, not publicly, not in any record that survives. He did not have to. Some things settle into a man early and stay there through every promotion, every command, every year that follows, waiting for the moment they are needed again. That moment came 11 years later, on the 1st of September, 1945, in the ruins of a naval base called Yokosuka. By then, Chester Nimitz was 60 years old, and he had spent nearly 4 years doing to the Imperial Japanese Navy exactly what Togo had once done to the Russians, only slower, across a wider ocean, one island and one convoy, and one carrier strike at a time. Tomorrow, on the deck of the USS Missouri, the papers would be signed, and the war would end in the history books. Tonight, he was walking alone through what remained of Japan's most important naval installation, past the docks and the dry docks and the repair yards that had once kept the enemy's fleet in the fight, and he stopped in front of something that should not have mattered to anyone anymore. A ship, if it could still be called that, sitting on dry land at the harbor's edge, its hull sealed in concrete, its paint peeling from the superstructure. American soldiers had already been through it, stripping out clocks and instruments and anything small enough to carry home as a souvenir. It had not been to sea in more than 20 years. Its name was Mikasa. Nimitz stood in front of it for a long time. The evening air off the harbor smelled of salt and diesel and something burnt that never quite left the ruined base, and somewhere behind him, a work party was still hauling debris off a pier that no longer served any purpose. He did not call anyone over. He simply stood there, one man in a uniform that no longer had an army of reporters chasing it, looking at a hull that had once carried the most feared admiral in the Pacific into the battle that made his name. Every officer who had studied naval warfare in the first 4 decades of the century knew that name, knew what had happened aboard it in the strait off Tsushima, knew the man who had once stood on its bridge and changed what the world believed was possible for a fleet that had trained itself hard enough and waited long enough for its moment. Nimitz had seen that man once, in a garden, when he was 20 years old, and had no idea what his own life was about to become. Now he was the one who had just finished the work Togo had started. And there were people, powerful people, sitting at the same table where the peace was being written, who wanted this ship gone. That decision was not going to be an easy one to make, and it was not going to be his alone to make quietly. Nimitz did not tell anyone what he was thinking as he stood in front of Mikasa that evening. There was no order given on the spot, no dramatic declaration to the men around him, because there were no men around him. That was how he preferred to work. He had spent 4 years making decisions that would be read about for the rest of the century, and almost none of them had been announced with any ceremony at all. He turned and walked back toward the vehicle, waiting to take him to his quarters, past sailors clearing debris in the fading light, past the twisted remains of cranes that had once serviced the largest warships in the Imperial fleet, and he said nothing to any of them about what he had just decided. He simply walked back to his quarters, and somewhere in the days that followed, word went out. The ship was not to be touched. No further looting. No further stripping of what remained. Whatever was going to happen to that hull, it was not going to happen by neglect, and it was not going to happen because someone decided it was easier to let it rot than to protect it. The men who wanted it gone were not shy about saying so. The Soviet Union had entered the Pacific War in its final week, a declaration of war against Japan that came after the atomic bombs had already fallen, after the outcome was no longer in doubt. But the Soviets were at the table now. They were one of the Allied powers with a voice in what post-war Japan would look like. And to men in Moscow who remembered their history, Mikasa was not a museum piece. It was a monument to the worst naval humiliation in Russian history, a defeat that had cost thousands of lives and helped trigger a revolution that shook the empire to its foundations. Tsushima had never stopped being an open wound. Now the ship that caused it was sitting derelict in a defeated country, and the men who wanted it erased had genuine standing to make that demand. Nimitz was not in the business of erasing things because someone found them painful to look at. He had grown up in a small Texas town built by German immigrants who carried their own history with them across an ocean, and he understood, in a way that maybe not every officer of his generation understood, that a nation's memory was not something you could legislate out of existence just because it embarrassed your allies. Mikasa was going to stay where it was. That was not a political position. He never framed it as one. It was simply a decision, made quietly, by a man who had the authority to make it and the will to see it through. There was no confrontation over it, at least not one that made its way into any written record. No shouting match in a conference room. No cable fired off to Moscow laying out terms. That was not how men like Nimitz settled things that mattered to them. He simply made his position clear to the officers under his own command, in the flat, unadorned language he used for every order he gave, and the matter was treated, from that point forward, as settled. The Soviet delegation could raise the issue again at whatever table it wanted to raise it at. The ship itself was no longer going to be part of the conversation. Guards walked its deck at night now, and the looting that had stripped its instruments and fittings in the first chaotic days of the occupation came to a stop almost immediately, the way most undisciplined behavior stops the moment someone with real authority decides it will. The next morning came fast. Tokyo Bay was full of gray steel, more warships gathered in one place than most of the men on their decks would ever see again in their lives. Sailors crowded the rails of destroyers and cruisers anchored well back from the Missouri, straining for a view of a deck most of them would never set foot on, and the low murmur of thousands of men trying to talk quietly, carried out over the water in a way that no one who was there ever fully forgot. The sky that morning was overcast, gray on gray, the harbor flat and still, as though even the weather understood that this was not a day for anything dramatic to happen in the sky. The USS Missouri sat at the center of it, its deck cleared and prepared, tables set with the instruments of surrender, cameras positioned at every angle that mattered. Nimitz had been irritated about the arrangements for weeks now, and he had said so plainly to Admiral King back in Washington. A war fought island by island across the widest ocean on Earth, fought by sailors and Marines who died on beaches most Americans could not find on a map, and the ceremony that would end it was going to be run by an Army general standing at the microphone for the cameras. He said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it, and then he let it go, because that was what the job required now. He put on his dress uniform. He walked onto the deck of the Missouri. He did his job. General Douglas MacArthur approached the table where the documents were waiting, and he was carrying 5 pens. He had planned every detail of this moment in advance, the way a man plans something he intends to be remembered for. The first pen went to General Jonathan Wainwright, the man who had surrendered the Philippines back in 1942 when MacArthur was ordered to leave, and who had spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp and arrived on that deck so thin his uniform hung off him like it belonged to someone else. Men who had served with Wainwright before the war barely recognized him when he stepped off the plane that brought him to Tokyo Bay, and photographs taken that week show a man whose eyes seemed to belong to someone 20 years older than the general who had left the Philippines. The second pen went to a British general who had surrendered Singapore. A third pen was set aside for West Point, a fourth for his wife. He kept the last one for himself. 5 pens, 5 destinations, each one chosen and placed on a list that existed before he ever stepped onto that deck. MacArthur spoke for 4 minutes. His voice carried across the deck through loudspeakers rigged for the occasion, and men standing on ships hundreds of yards away could hear every word of it drift out over the water. Then the Japanese delegation signed, men in formal dress standing stiff and silent in front of the cameras of the nation that had just defeated them, their faces giving away nothing to the photographers straining for a reaction that never came. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He had 1 pen, a green Parker fountain pen, unremarkable, the kind any officer might have carried in his breast pocket without a second thought. He signed his name and handed it back to an aide standing near the table. He stepped back. A correspondent covering the ceremony that day wrote, that evening, filing his story from a cramped press area set up on a neighboring deck, that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly it would have been easy to miss that he had been there at all. That was not an accident, and it was not modesty performed for an audience either, because there was no audience left there to perform it for. It was simply how the man operated, and it had always been how the man operated. The war was over. He had done what needed doing. There was no reason to make more of the moment than the moment actually required of him. MacArthur's aircraft lifted off toward Tokyo that afternoon. He had been named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, and he would run the country from an office building in the middle of the city for the next several years, reshaping its government, its constitution, its entire relationship to the rest of the world. Japanese soldiers lined his motorcade routes with their backs turned outward, a gesture of respect the Imperial Army had once reserved for the Emperor alone. Crowds gathered along the roads he traveled, silent, watching a foreign general move through their capital the way no foreign soldier had ever moved through it before, not as a conqueror kicking down doors, but as a man who intended to stay and rebuild the place from the inside. The Japanese newspapers would eventually give him a nickname, the Blue-Eyed Shogun. It was not entirely meant as a compliment, and it was not entirely meant as an insult either. It was simply what he had become in their eyes, whether he intended it or not, a figure of near-total authority who occupied the palace of power without ever occupying the palace itself. Nimitz's aircraft turned the other direction, back toward Pearl Harbor, where a desk and a report were waiting for him. Several hundred pages, covering every major campaign of the Pacific War from December of 1941 to August of 1945. He wrote what had gone right and why. He wrote what had failed without naming the individual officers responsible for the failures, because that was not the purpose of the document, and he was not interested in settling scores on paper. He submitted it to the Navy Department. It received no press coverage. He never mentioned that to anyone either. It simply went into a filing cabinet in Washington, the official record of the largest naval campaign in human history, written by the man who had commanded it, read by almost no one outside the building where it was filed. There was no ghostwriter attached to it, no editor shaping its sentences for a wider audience, no thought given to how it would read outside the small circle of officers who would ever have reason to open it. It was a working document, written by a man who had spent 4 years believing that the only history worth recording accurately was the kind that helped the next commander avoid the mistakes of the last one. There is a version of the following 2 years that could be told quickly, the way a resume gets told, one line for each promotion and each title. President Truman nominated Nimitz to succeed Admiral King as Chief of Naval Operations. The Senate confirmed him. He moved to Washington. He did the job. But the years themselves were not lived quickly, and the man who lived through them did not experience them as a resume. He experienced them as a slow, grinding difference between the war he had just fought and the peace he was now being asked to manage. Washington, in the fall of 1945, was a city consumed with the question of what the American military was supposed to become now that the two enemies who had defined it for 4 years were gone. Budgets had to be cut. Millions of men in uniform wanted to go home, and the country wanted them home too, wanted its factories retooled for something other than warships and aircraft, wanted its attention turned toward anything except the machinery of fighting. The Army Air Forces were pushing hard to become their own branch of service entirely, an independent air force, and the question of what that split would mean for naval aviation, for the future of the aircraft carrier, for who would control which weapons and which missions, was being fought out in committee rooms and budget hearings and staff papers with the same intensity that had once gone into planning amphibious landings. Nimitz had to manage the contraction of the largest naval force the world had ever assembled while arguing, in rooms full of men who had already made up their minds, that the Navy deserved to survive that contraction intact. He told his wife Catherine that he hated Washington, not the city itself, with its wide avenues and its marble buildings and its slow, humid summers that had never bothered him much in his younger years. He had lived there before, earlier in his career, and had managed well enough. What he hated was what the work had become. At Pearl Harbor in the early months of 1942, sitting at a desk that looked out over a harbor still black with oil from the ships that had burned there on December 7th, every decision he made had a consequence he could trace with his own eyes. He could see what he had to work with. He could read the dispatches coming in from submarines and carriers and shore stations, and understand exactly what they meant in terms of real things: ships, men, positions on a chart, the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. A wrong decision meant sailors died. A right one meant the enemy's ships went down instead of his own. The weight of that responsibility was terrible, heavier than almost anything a man could be asked to carry. But it was honest weight. It was the weight of something real, something he could hold in his hands and understand. In Washington, a wrong decision meant a budget line shifted by 3%. A right one meant a committee chairman felt respected enough to support a piece of legislation before it died in subcommittee. The consequences were measured in units that meant nothing to a man who had spent 4 years measuring consequences in ships and lives. He had spent the war deciding whether young Americans lived or died, and now he sat in rooms where the most pressing question of the afternoon was whether the Navy would be allowed to keep a particular type of carrier aircraft, or whether that mission would be handed over to the newly formed Air Force. It was not that the questions were unimportant. It was that they were the wrong shape for the kind of man he had always been, and he knew it, and he stayed anyway, because the job required it, and Nimitz had never once in his career been a man who walked away from what the job required of him. Aides who worked near his office in those years remembered him staring out the window for long stretches during the slower afternoons, not idle, just somewhere else for a moment, the way a man looks when part of him is still standing on a different shore. He never spoke about it. He signed the papers in front of him, answered the questions put to him in hearings, with the same measured, unhurried tone he had used in front of war correspondents at Pearl Harbor, and gave no one in that building a reason to think the work was costing him anything at all. But something in him had changed the moment the guns went quiet, and 2 years of budget hearings were not going to change it back. But when his 2-year term as Chief of Naval Operations came to its natural end in December of 1947, he did not extend it. He did not maneuver for another term or angle for a different post that would keep him in the capital. There was no farewell dinner organized for the cameras, no memoir announced to publishers, no board seats or consulting arrangements lined up and waiting for him on the other side of retirement. He handed the office to his successor, Admiral Louis Denfeld, said whatever needed to be said in the transition, and left the building. He flew back to California, to a small piece of land called Yerba Buena Island, sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, where the Navy maintained quarters for senior officers, and where he had already been spending as much time as Washington would allow him to steal. He walked every morning along the water, past the same stretch of shoreline, at roughly the same hour, whether the fog had rolled in off the bay or not. He tended a garden with his own hands, kneeling in the dirt the way a man does when there is no aide nearby to hand him a tool and no reason to hurry through the work. He read, slowly and without any particular agenda, books that had nothing to do with naval strategy or fleet dispositions or the war he had just spent the better part of a decade fighting, and then explaining, and then trying to walk away from with some dignity and tact. Visitors who came out to the island noticed how differently he carried himself there, unhurried in a way Washington had never once allowed him to be, as though the tide itself had finally given him permission to stop bracing for the next dispatch. By nearly every account left behind by the people who knew him in those years, he was, for the first time in a very long time, at ease. He did not give speeches about what the war had meant, though plenty of men would have paid to hear him give one. He did not write the kind of memoir that other commanders of his stature wrote in the years that followed, the kind full of vindication and score settling, and careful positioning for how history would remember them. He simply lived on an island in the middle of a bay, close enough to the water that he could hear it from where he sat in the evenings, and he let the years pass without demanding that they be anything other than what they were. But the ship in Yokosuka was still sitting there, still deteriorating, slower now under guard than it had been in the chaotic weeks right after the surrender, but deteriorating all the same, the way anything left exposed to salt air and neglect eventually gives way to time, no matter how many orders are issued to protect it. Rain found its way into seams that had once been watertight. Rust bled down through the paint in long orange streaks that no one had the budget or the mandate to scrub away. Birds nested in sections of the superstructure that had once housed some of the most advanced naval equipment in the world. Concrete does not last forever. Steel does not hold its shape forever once the men who once maintained it are gone and the money that once flowed toward it has dried up. Nimitz had bought the ship time in 1945. He had not solved its problem. Time, by itself, was never going to be enough to save it. And everyone who cared about that ship, in Japan and in the small circle of American officers who understood what it represented, knew that eventually something more than a guard detail was going to be required. For more than a decade, nothing more came. The ship sat. The occupation ended in 1952, and with it went the daily American presence that had, almost as an afterthought, kept the worst of the looting and vandalism at bay. Japan rebuilt itself, slowly and then with startling speed, into something the men who had fought against it in the Pacific would barely have recognized. Its cities rising back out of the ash, its industry retooling from warplanes to automobiles and radios, and the machinery of a country determined never to fight that kind of war again. The world moved on to other wars, other crises, other men in other uniforms making other decisions under other kinds of pressure. In Korea and then elsewhere, each one pulling attention further away from a rusting hull sitting behind a fence, in a port town most of the world had already stopped thinking about. Nimitz grew older on his island. He was no longer the most powerful admiral in the Pacific. He was simply an old man with a garden and a view of the water, and if the story had ended there, it would still have been a story worth telling. A man who won a war, and then had the sense to let it go. But the story did not end there, and neither did the ship. In 1958, a group of men in Japan decided the ship deserved better than slow decay behind a fence. They were former naval officers, historians, ordinary citizens, who remembered what Mikasa had once meant to their country, and believed it should not simply be allowed to rust into nothing. They organized a preservation society. They needed money. They needed legitimacy. And they needed a name that would mean something in both countries. A name that would tell contributors on both sides of the Pacific that this was not an attempt to glorify a war that had ended in catastrophe, but an attempt to preserve a piece of naval history that belonged to everyone who studied it. Eventually, after weighing who among the surviving American officers might actually answer, they wrote to Chester Nimitz in California. He was 72 years old by then, long retired, spending his days on Yerba Buena Island the way he had for a decade, walking, gardening, reading. He had no obligation to answer that letter. No one in Washington was going to ask him why he ignored it. No treaty required his involvement. No order from any navy on Earth could have compelled a retired admiral to spend his own money on a foreign warship most Americans had never heard of and would not have cared about if they had. He wrote a check. His own money, from his own account, the first American contribution to the Mikasa Restoration Fund. And then he did something that mattered even more than the check itself. He put his name to the effort publicly, lent his reputation to it, and that single act brought other American contributors behind him almost immediately. Men who would never have given $1 to restore a Japanese battleship gave money because Chester Nimitz had decided it was worth doing. And if he believed that, most of them were willing to trust his judgment on it. The restoration took nearly 2 years. Engineers had to rebuild sections of the hull that had rotted through. Historians worked to restore the ship's fittings and armament to something close to their original condition, tracking down photographs and blueprints and, in some cases, the original manufacturers in England who had built the ship's fittings more than half a century earlier. Craftsmen who had never worked on anything like it before learned, piece by piece, how a pre-dreadnought battleship from the turn of the century had actually been built. On May 27, 1961, the 56th anniversary of the Battle of Tsushima, The same battle that had made the ship famous and infamous, depending entirely on which side of the strait you had been standing on, Mikasa reopened as a museum. They placed a statue of Togo on the grounds beside it, the man who had stood on that very bridge, the man whose face a 20-year-old American midshipman had once studied across a crowded garden in Tokyo, 56 years earlier, almost to the day. The ship is still there now. It sits just outside the gates of Commander Fleet Activities Yokosuka, the largest American naval installation in the Western Pacific, home port to the United States 7th Fleet. The nation that spent 4 years trying to sink every ship the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed now keeps its primary naval presence in the region within sight of the bridge where Togo once stood and changed the shape of the 20th century. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the commander of United States Naval Forces Japan goes aboard Mikasa for a memorial ceremony, standing alongside officers of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. Two navies that once tried to destroy each other completely, standing together on the deck of a ship that one of them built and the other helped save from disappearing. Nimitz did not arrange that outcome deliberately. He was not thinking, in 1958, about what a ceremony would look like 60 years later. He was thinking about a ship and a decision, and what the right thing to do was in front of him at that moment. But the outcome exists now, and it stands in Yokosuka to this day, built on nothing more than a check an old man wrote because he remembered something he had seen when he was 20 years old. There is a small town in the Texas Hill Country called Fredericksburg, settled by German immigrants in the 1840s, a town of stone buildings and quiet streets that still does not look like anywhere else in the state. Chester Nimitz was born there in 1885. His grandfather had run a hotel on the main street shaped like the prow of a ship, complete with a wooden bridge built onto the roof, and the family had roots in that town that went back generations before Chester ever left it at 16 to seek an appointment to the Naval Academy. After the war, the town built a museum in his name, centered around his grandfather's old hotel, telling the story of the Pacific Campaign and the man who had commanded it. And then, on May 8, 1976, something was dedicated on the grounds of that museum that had never been there before. A Japanese garden. Not a small decorative corner, but a full and carefully built traditional garden. Stone lanterns, a koi pond, plantings arranged with the kind of patience that takes years to get right. The Japanese government had supported its construction. Japanese citizens had contributed to its cost. Japanese craftsmen had traveled all the way to a small town in the Texas Hill Country to build it with their own hands. They called it the Garden of Peace. It was a gift, offered without any request attached to it, offered simply because the people who built it believed the man that town was named for had earned it. Chester Nimitz had died 10 years earlier, in February of 1966, at the age of 80. He never saw the garden. He never knew it was coming. The ceremony that dedicated it took place with American and Japanese officials standing together, speeches given, photographs taken, all the formal weight that an event like that carries. The man being honored had been gone for a decade. His grandfather's old hotel, the one shaped like a ship, still stood on Main Street, exactly where it had stood since before Chester was born, and the garden built beside it is still there today. Anyone who drives through Fredericksburg can walk through it. Here is what the record actually shows. Once you set aside everything that gets added to a story in the retelling. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet from the final day of 1941 to the first days of September 1945. He oversaw the campaigns that pushed the Japanese Navy out of the Central Pacific, that cut its supply lines, that brought American forces close enough to the home islands to end the war. When it was over, he stood on the deck of the Missouri, signed his name, put the pen back in his pocket, and returned to work. He did not need 5 pens. He did not need a title in Tokyo. He did not need a microphone or a crowd to tell him what the moment meant. When his allies wanted to destroy the flagship of Japan's greatest admiral, he made certain it would not happen. When a group of Japanese citizens needed someone to write the first check toward saving it for good, he wrote it. When Washington wanted to keep him behind a desk for the rest of his career, he did the job for 2 years, and then went home to walk beside the water for the rest of his life. And in a small town in the Texas Hill Country, on land his family had known since before he was born, the people of the nation he had spent 4 years fighting built him a garden he never lived to see. It would be easy to read all of this and decide that Nimitz was simply a gentle man, a forgiving one, someone who felt sorry for Japan and wanted to help it heal. That is not what the record actually supports. The record shows a man who sent submarines to strangle Japan's supply of food and fuel, who authorized campaigns that killed tens of thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers, who fought 4 years of war with one purpose only, to defeat the enemy in front of him as completely and as quickly as it could be done. He was not gentle about any of that, and he was never supposed to be. That was the job, and he did it without flinching. What he was, instead, was finished when it was finished. That is a different thing entirely, and it is rarer than most people assume. Some men need to stand on the battlefield long after the fighting has ended. They need the monuments built in their own image, the flags, the ceremonies, the chance to keep pointing to the place where they once stood. Nimitz came home from the largest naval war in history and left behind, in his own country, a museum about the war itself, not about the man who won it. He left behind, in the country he had defeated, a ship that belonged to someone else, a ship he chose to save simply because he remembered a garden in Tokyo when he was 20 years old, and an old admiral who had won everything there was to win, and still found no reason to act like it. If you had a father or a grandfather who served in the Pacific, on a ship, in a submarine, on a beach somewhere that never made it into the history books, this is the moment to say his name. Leave it in the comments. The branch, the theater, whatever you still remember. Because the men in this story did not fight for the monuments. They fought so that the people sitting where you are sitting right now would never have to. The least any of us can do is say their names out loud and make sure none of them are allowed to disappear.